Hello and welcome. I'm Michael F. Brown, President School for Advanced Research in Santa Fe, New Mexico. I'm speaking to you today from my office in SAR's administration building. I will be co-moderating this event with Paul Ryer, my colleague, who's director of our scholar programs at SAR. Our featured speaker and author today is Chip Colwell. Before I introduce Chip, I just want to remind you that we will have time for questions. We expect to have time for questions at about the 45-minute mark. And you should put questions, if you have them, in the Q&A panel rather than the chat function of the webinar platform. We'll do the best we can to answer them. In some cases, if we see redundancies, we may combine questions. And just depending on how many there are, we may not get to all of them. Chip Colwell, PhD, is editor-in-chief of the website sapiens.org, the online anthropology magazine. He's widely published in newspapers and magazines such as the New York Times, the Atlantic, and the Guardian. His 2017 book, Plundered Skulls and Stolen Spirits, Inside the Fight to Reclaim Native America's Culture, has earned major trade reviews and 6 prizes. We at SAR are delighted to have him with us today to discuss his most recent book, So Much Stuff, How Humans Discovered Tools, Invented Meaning, and Made More of Everything. I look forward to an engaging conversation. Chip and Paul, please join me.
Hello. Hi.
So, Chip, could you tell us a little bit? First of all, thank you for joining us for this event. We're really grateful. You're talking to us from a radio studio, I gather, in Denver. Which says a lot about the interest in your project in this particular book. So, could you give us some background on how you got interested in this? Before we started, I was just saying there's a little bit of big history in this, which, as you know, is a kind of a movement right now that you start at least 1 million years ago and bring the story of human inventiveness and material productions up to the present day. But it's unusual, and of course we'll dive into the details. But what's the general background of your interest in this topic?
Thank you so much for having me. I really look forward to this conversation. And indeed, I never really pictured myself writing a book like this one, big history, and I, in a very real sense, stumbled onto it. And I stumbled onto it one day when I was visiting my sister a number of years ago. And she lives in Seattle. We were there for the holidays. And she asked me, Chip, why do we have so much stuff? And I felt like as an archaeologist, then I was a museum curator surrounded by stuff. My job was to collect stuff, explain stuff. I'd studied material culture for, since high school, really. I didn't have a ready answer. And I looked around our house and I saw what's, is kind of a typical house with couches and rugs and tables. And you knew in the kitchen is Tupperware and candlesticks and matches and everything else. And being an archaeologist, I know that if you go far enough back in time to about 4 million years ago, there's essentially no evidence or very little evidence of those most ancient ancestors needing anything to survive. And yet here we are in our world today with couches and houses and nuclear weapons and whoopee cushions and everything in between, So it really stumped me, this question of how did we go from nothing to everything across those 4 million years? And that really set me off on a journey to try to come up with some understanding and some explanation to my sister first, and then to readers as well.
I've got a question, then I'll do a handoff to Paul. So you divide the book into 3 sort of phases of human evolution in terms of its relationship to material production, let's say. So what are could you talk about those a little bit?
Sure, yeah. So the big picture is that I didn't find the answer in one place. I'd kind of initially thought surely some archaeologists have tackled this, and when they hadn't, I didn't find kind of a rich literature there. I thought, well, certainly museum specialists, maybe they've figured this out. Well, no, well, maybe, people who look at industrial history, maybe they figured this out. Well, how about psychologists? people who study the history of business and globalization. And I never really found the answer in one specific discipline. So this really ended up being a big history, but across, multiple disciplines. And I found a lot of joy actually digging into parts of literature that I'd never even fathomed prior to this. And part of that was because as an archaeologist, you typically have pretty narrow foci. It's a particular time, like Chaco Canyon, particular landscape, particular time period, 1,000 years ago to 1,200 years ago. But I really wanted to look at not just the specific cultural notes of objects, but what is the larger symphony of all of humanity's material culture, and what would that tell us about where we've been and how we got to our world today, which is a world of overstuffed things. And so as I looked across that literature, I devised what I saw as three major leaps across our human story. And the first leap was the mere discovery of tools, the realization that things like rocks could be broken apart and sharp edges could be created, and you could use that sharp edge stone for cutting things. That was really a magical moment. It's as important as the invention of the wheel itself, of the printing press. The splitting of the atom, almost any other technology you can imagine. This moment that we think happened about 3.4 million years ago in East Africa is really the signal event in our evolutionary history. So that's the first step, and there's a lot that follows with that. I'm sure we'll get into it. But the second step happens when our ancient ancestors realized that these tools also can be imbued with meaning, and that these aren't merely things that achieve a particular useful end, but that these things can have meanings such as aesthetic values, that an object can speak to the power of gods, that things can be traded and have value, that things can be passed between generations and become a form of memory. So that second phase is really about the invention of meaning. And we believe that probably happened, it might have happened with some of the early stone tools about 1.5 million years ago. You begin to see echoes of it about 500,000 years ago. But by about 50,000 years ago, that is firmly in place. We really see meaning blossoming across humanity's material culture. And then the third step, the third leap, happens in a much more recent phase, and that is really the beginnings of globalization, European colonialization, and imperialism about 500 years ago. This is the birth of global trade, the merchant class banking that creates a kind of infrastructure for what eventually leads to the industrial revolutions. And those industrial revolutions create not merely the capacity for abundance, material abundance, being able to produce more and more, faster and faster, cheaper and cheaper, but in tandem with that is an ideology of abundance, this notion that abundance is a good thing, and that our lives can only be made better, our lives can only be made of value through things themselves. So that very last leap is a leap of abundance as a practice and an ideology. And I hope maybe we'll end on what I think might be a fourth leap that we are probably nearing quite soon.
Paul?
Yeah, thank you. Chip, this was so fun to read, honestly. Like you, I spend a lot of my reading time in sort of specialized, narrow domains, and I don't get to breathe intellectually because I don't read the big books like this, and so it's just as fun to read as I hope it was to write. And I learned a lot throughout your text, a lot of updates in the archaeological work you reference and sort of are processing. I love that you go way back in time, millions of years, and then bring as a sort of an archaeological intermediate stopping point, the Iceman, Otzi, and that's really helpful because you see right there a lot of the arc you're talking about, and then that sets up the more recent stuff, which I think most of us as readers and as people in this world in the 21st century can sort of relate to because we're surrounded by stuff all the time, too much stuff. I am trained as a cultural anthropologist. I was a student of Marshall Solon, so just to give you a sense of where I'm coming from. I have a question for you about the relationship between the tool and the meaning. And this really is that first part. You sort of put the tool first, and then the meaning follows. And my question is, does that necessarily, are we sure about that order archaeologically? Or because I'm thinking of, Levi Strauss's famous line, we don't name things because they're useful because we name them. And in other words, even you have this beautiful speculative thing about that first person picking up a stone and using it in new ways. Wasn't there some sort of meaningful action there right in the inception of the tool? Couldn't you sort of flip that around a little bit and say the meaning precedes the tool rather than vice versa?
It's a fascinating question that is, in fact, very difficult to determine archaeologically. And, what we are using as evidence are essentially a handful of broken rocks and a handful of broken bones with cut marks on them, or bones that have been smashed apart. As you say, just to briefly touch on the book itself, it really was fun to write and to research. This is a book that I wrote for the general public. It's meant to be, broadly accessible. And so to do that, I went on a lot of journeys. I went to a lot of places, to Ethiopia, to New Zealand, to Hong Kong, traveling around, trying to reveal these stories. And so, like in Ethiopia, I was at the National Museum of Ethiopia, where they have some of these very earliest pieces of evidence of the first stone tools. And there are a couple bones that are about, I don't know, this long, kind of like almost like piano keys, white and textured like ivory. And they just have these very simple cut marks on them. And you would think almost nothing of it. In fact, Zureh Almastad, who was the archaeologist who helped find them, said when they first dug them up from the earth, he didn't even think anything of them. It was only till they really inspected those cut marks that they determined exactly what they were and how old they were. So they're very innocuous, and that's the kind of evidence that we're looking at. I think the reason why it is speculated that tools preceded meaning is because for meaning, typically you need things like symbolic thinking. You need some form of language itself to understand that if you use the word stone, that references an actual stone in the real world, right? So that language itself is a kind of prerequisite for meaning. And based on the anticipated cognitive abilities, these very first stone tools weren't even made by our own genus Homo. These go back even further in our family tree to Australopithecines. So these are, if you know the famous fossil Lucy, Dinkinesh, as she's called in Amharic in Ethiopia, that's the species we're talking about. And based on our understanding of what their cognitive abilities were and their other ways of how they lived, it seems unlikely that they would have had sophisticated language or even the beginnings of language. So, I do think what's really interesting is, to answer your question, is, more directly, is when exactly then does meaning come into play? And there have been some speculations that after those very first tools are made, about 3.5 million years ago, then you get the Oldowan toolkit, which is kind of the first formal form of stone technology. And after that, you get the Acheulean hand axe. And the Acheulean hand axe are these beautiful teardrop-shaped stones, typically quite thin. And when you look at how they've been used, you actually can't find use marks on them. So they weren't really maybe always used as axes. They weren't used for chopping. So what were they used for? So one hypothesis is that maybe this is actually the very first form of art, that they were made as a demonstration of something beautiful. And they are beautiful to our eye today. There was even a art show of these Acheulean hand axes and other early stone technologies. So in short, perhaps meaning does come in much, much earlier than we might naturally think or assume. But defining exactly when that moment comes in is incredibly challenging if you're just basing it strictly on the evidence of stone technology.
Chip, it is the case, and just to give a sense of timescale, that these early stone traditions lasted thousands and thousands of years without identifiable changes, right? They had a real stability. And then at some point, and this is consistent with your kind of view of the logarithmic growth of technology, and then tools to make tools and industrialization and so on, is that, do we understand that as expressive of genetic or cognitive changes in proto-humans and eventually early ancestors?
It's truly mind-blowing when you consider that, we have a new iPhone every 6 months or whatever it is, relative to these first stone technologies that indeed lasts tens and hundreds of thousands of years. Some, like the Oldowan technology, is about 1,000,000 years of, essentially continuity of that same technology. The Acheulean hand axe tradition, which I mentioned, similarly hundreds of thousands of years. So there is a lot of stability. It does seem that when these early stone technologies emerge, they are so hugely useful to those first humans, those first human ancestors, that they are not elaborating on them. But perhaps they also just don't have the cognitive ability to fully elaborate them as what some scholars would call creative tool users. In other words, finding new ways, new creative ways of problem solving with tools. So there is something to speak about in terms of the stability of those early technologies in relation to those early humans' ability to foster change. Now, that being said, as I talk about in the book, one really fascinating element of the invention of stone tools is the way those tools then begin to change our ancestors' bodies. So, for example, if you don't have a stone cutting tool to chop up meat, and you just try to gnaw into a big slab of meat, you need really sharp teeth and really robust jaws and a digestive tract that can really handle that. But if you have a stone tool that can cut, it's essentially like an external tooth. So it's cutting for you before you even begin processing it through your body. So what happens is the body itself begins to shift in its evolution with smaller teeth, smaller jaw, the internal digestive tract changes. And what that does is not only does that mean you're inputting more calories, but those calories can go to a brain that is opening up space in the skull and also is getting smarter and smarter. So eventually, that technology and the symbiotic relationship that it creates with our ancestors' bodies, what some call techno-organic evolution, do lead to some major leaps cognitively and practically.
Yeah, you spelled that out in the text, and it was really fun to think about that, the way the ability, even a simple stone edge, right, would allow somebody to finally chop meat into a paste, sort of make a hamburger instead of a big chunk of steak. And I assume that was all before fire, correct? We think that all of that was before the control of fire. Humans weren't cooking food, they were just chopping it up first. Is that right?
There was definitely chopping before cooking. That's another hotly debated area, exactly when fire enters the picture and when controlled fire enters the picture, and then when cooking itself. But certainly there's almost no evidence that in the early stages, 3 million years plus, there's no evidence that there's fire involved. That really is just stone technology. And fire might follow, million years or even a couple million years after that. So we're talking about, untold generations going along with just stone tools. But that being said, if you talk to enough archaeologists, they'll explain that we just find in the archaeological record the things that survive. So, after stone tools, or even before, there might have been wood tools. For example, perhaps, very famously, chimpanzees use straw to collect termites as fishing rods. Those kinds of technologies very well might have been in place prior to stone technology or after it. But the chances of a little piece of straw surviving 3 million years, in the dirt is very minimal. So we go on the evidence that we have, but it's definitely possible. And some of the leading scholars in this area, like Kathy and Nick Toth, do suggest there probably was quite a wealth of material life millions of years ago, but all we're really seeing is just a little sliver of that through what survives.
I just love the image that our ancestors for 1 million years or more were making hamburger and eating it just with these simple stone edges. So
probably without the buns,
without no buns, exactly. The low carb version, but man, what a diet.
Well, moving on to the carb version, or sort of getting into the Neolithic, I don't know if you talk about, but as you're discussing this, it made me think that agriculture, even at an incipient stage, requires storage in a way that hunting and gathering typically don't. I mean, there are always exceptions, preservation technologies and so on in the Arctic and elsewhere. But the reality is that agriculturists absolutely depend on storage. And so as a kind of first stage hoarding, of your crop, which upon which your life depends. Does that seem reasonable? I mean, do you see that as an important, it's obviously an important tipping point in terms of human evolution, but in terms of the relationship to objects?
It's definitively a linchpin in our story of stuff. I think, anecdotally, most of us probably know that, when you stay somewhere, you tend to accumulate a lot of stuff, and the longer you stay there, the more stuff you have. I think a lot of us experience that. And that would have been true for our early ancestors in the Neolithic as well. So as our ancestors around the world about 10,000-ish years ago begin shifting, some groups begin shifting from a more nomadic kind of lifestyle to a sedentary one, picking up farming, which requires you to really be in one place. There's a cascade of material consequences to that. Most basically, you need farming equipment. If you have land that you need to protect, you probably also now need more sophisticated weapons. If you are stuck in one place, no matter thick or thin, any kind of weather, you need more robust architecture, and then you need more tools to create the more robust architecture. Once you begin to settle down, the famous, as the story goes, famously, you begin to have hierarchies and social strata. And then a fundamental part of this is surplus, the ability to actually have an abundance of food stuff and other kinds of materials, whether it's things like wheat or barley, or, food on the hoof in the form of goats or sheep or cattle, corn, if you're looking in the Americas, right? You have all the ability to create a surplus. And then what do you do with that surplus? Well, you can buy things, you can buy labor, you can establish generational wealth, right? So it's really that ability to create a surplus that, in addition to all the material items that you need to survive once you're settling down, allows for just radically new ways of reformulating our relationship to things.
Can I jump in on that? I had a question. You had tied this notion of hoarding, and this is later in the book, but since Michael brought it up, you tied that to a deep history. Other animal species have some animals, although never a majority of species, right? But have these tendencies to hoard, squirrels and so forth. But then, as you say, it clearly makes more sense once you're in the Neolithic. However, one thing you don't really sort of wrestle with in the text, although I know you know it, is the notion that in a hunting and gathering mode of production, you have a disincentive to hoard because you have to be mobile, and anything heavy is going to make your life difficult because you need to follow the herds and follow game seasonally, whatever the patterns. And this kind of was stuff that Marshall Sahlins wrote about many, many years ago. But I wondered whether that many millennia of hunting and gathering in our past would complicate the narrative that this is just a simply deep-rooted thing, because it seems like it really is more of a cultural change 12,000 years ago that had been probably evolutionarily discouraged for millions of years. Again, I'm not a specialist. I'm enjoying hearing your take, and I know we all have to speculate a little. We have limited evidence, but I'd love to hear your take on that, your reflections.
One thing that helped me understand a way to approach that question is how biologists do talk about a number of species, as you point out, hoard. And at the same time, there is a very fine balance within those species between over-hoarding, right? Because if you spend all of your time just thinking about the future, like you're hoarding food, for example, to survive the winter, but you're not thinking enough about the current moment, you may not survive to get to the winter to actually use that hoard. So if you look at animal species like squirrels, they use different strategies to hoard, but there's always this tension between future planning and current survival. And I suspect for our ancient human ancestors, this, especially in sort of a nomadic or, seasonal shifting mode, that they would have had to have thread that needle as well, that there would have been a strong incentive to cache food, to cache precious artifacts, to store other kinds of valued goods. And at the same time, if you're too forward looking, you're not going to survive to get to use it. So I think there's that. I think the other element that I draw upon that perhaps Solons might have appreciated is that, I suspect that our most ancient ancestors, we're talking about, let's say about 100,000 years ago onward, kind of late Ice Age peoples, I suspect that they would have wanted just as much as we want today. That especially once you get things like beads, things like clothing, things like musical instruments, things like art objects, religious objects, as those start to come in, I suspect that those would have been highly desired objects that people wanted just as much. Like, I don't think they were that different from us. I do think, though, that the difference is that they simply couldn't bring as much with them, that they simply couldn't produce as much as perhaps they wanted because of the scarcity of materials, because of when you're traveling, you have to travel light, because you can't, again, be too forward looking. So, I think, and what I base that on is that if you look at the material life of those ancestors in that period, they're producing many of the things that we love today, that we love ourselves, and that we highly, highly value. So and if you look at a lot of contemporary hunter-gatherer groups, they're just as possessive, they're just as, materialistic, really, as many of us in very different cultural settings. It's just the difference is that you're limited by the resources, by your survival strategies, by the mechanisms that you have to obtain and sustain a materialistic lifestyle. So that would sort of be my reading of it. I'm not sure how that fits your.
Well, I thought your case study of the spear point cache found in Colorado was really fascinating, and that's something Solons never really wrestled with, the way in which nomadic people did sort of stockpile tools. Maybe those were spear points good for a particular type of game hunting in a particular part of an annual migration, and you didn't want to lug them with you for another 1,000 miles, but you knew you'd need them again next year. Makes perfect sense, right? Mm-hmm. That you put them somewhere safe, and so I think there's some interesting evidence there that you deploy for that sort of dynamic. Yeah.
Can I move the discussion on to money and currency? You do a nice job of talking about the important fact that a universal medium of exchange facilitates economic transactions and so on, but you end up I think, at least implicitly supporting the David Graeber position that money is really all about power and control. Could you talk about that a little bit, or how, I mean, Graeber, was a complex thinker. I'm sure he recognized that it had practical utility as well. And it also allowed accumulation in a way that wasn't nearly as easy if you were, collecting, I don't know what, large things, right? So what's your thought on the upside of money and the downside of money in terms of this accumulative process that your book is really about?
Well, to me, there's just a fascinating history, of course, to the invention of currency. And when you think about it, it's, again, in the same way, the first person who picked up that very first stone and realized it could be a cutting tool, the very first person that realized that you could have a measure of metal that represents a certain amount of money. That's just it's a brilliant turn in the human story. And this, of course, happened about 2,500 years ago in what's now northern Turkey. And a king realized, we don't know exactly, but more or less, we believe that a king and his advisors invented what we now understand as modern currency. And the story that historians and archaeologists long told was that this was essentially a means for trade. This is the birth of a merchant class in the modern sense, and it enabled modern banking. And scholars have tended to look at it simply through a kind of straightforward economic lens. And what David Graeber did was to ask the question of, was that truly the purpose of money, or did money have was it a means to other ends? And his answer was that it likely had means to other ends of power, of establishing power, and essentially controlling labor, especially.
Sure.
And so I think, where I end up on that is, I just don't think we have enough evidence. I think those are both, I see them as dueling hypotheses. And in the book, I just wanted to at least acknowledge that the long story that we've had about money may not be the right story. And, whether Graeber is fully right about the underlying motivations and the underlying consequences of the invention of modern currency, whether he's right about the origin story, I'm not sure based on the evidence, but certainly as it's played out over the millennia, there's something to that, right? That money is very much a part of our economic systems, but it's also fundamentally about power and control and labor. So at whether that's tied into the origin story, I think is to be determined, but it's certainly part of the larger story. Do you have strong feelings on that yourself?
Me? Well, no, but I
Yeah.
mean, it's no accident that many early coins have a profile of the ruler on them. I
Right.
mean, it's a statement about,
Yeah.
who is identified, or who makes this valuable, and who guarantees its value to whatever extent that could be guaranteed. And you do get into one of these, which came first, and I think people, as soon as currency became standardized, of course, whoever's doing the standardization has tremendous control and power. And today, of course, most of our transactions are taking place with zeros and ones. And it's a kind of collective hallucination that is controlled by banks and organizations that we cannot control, or not very well easily control. So I think there's a lot to be said for that argument, though it's obviously not the whole story.
Well, one of the other things David was doing is he points out that money is debt, right? And so there's this transformation of a Mosian, still coercive gift economy, but when we call it a gift economy, we're forgetting that obligation, Moses' 3 points: the obligation to give, obligation to receive, and the obligation to reciprocate. It's an obligatory system also. There's a coercive quality to those gift exchange systems, including the potlatch. You mentioned that, but David was pointing out that money is debt. and that it has these functions of serving power, but I think pointing out that it's debt. One of his dreams. I knew David. We were in grad school together, and he really was pushing, and you know this if you've read his work, for jubilees, for debt forgiveness. And he pointed out that those are amply reflected in the historical record, and he would have been all for the student debt forgiveness that got squelched a couple of years ago, saying, look, this is a part of how the system could reset itself in a more equitable way. So I think let's not leave that out, because that was one of his cherished goals in his analyses. So anyway, Michael, do you have another question, or do you want me to?
Well, we need to move on, and I don't want to. We're already past the 30-minute mark, and I want to hear Chip talk about the fourth phase, or what he hopes is the fourth phase. But I was just struck by a comment, and again, I've seen it in other settings, but it still struck me as powerful, which is that, again, talking about the modern era of marketing and the feelings that advertising tries to engender in the audience. You write, companies have less to gain by actually making their consumers happy, and much to gain by their discontentment. In other words, that the point of marketing is not to make you feel better or to provide something that makes you feel better. At another level, it's to generate this desire that you can never absolutely fulfill.
Well, the third leap really is about our modern sense of abundance and what is possible to create, but also what is possible to convince humans to desire. And that is, to me, the hallmark of this third leap. The invention of factories, modern factories, first powered by water wheels, and then later steam, and then electricity. All of that creates the capacity for material abundance, being able to, a widget not once, but millions of times, and to be able to do it at scale. And this, of course, began really in earnest in the late 1700s with the beginnings of the what's called the Arkwright machine, which transformed raw cotton to thread and yarn, and could do it far faster and far more cheaply than had ever been thought possible. And then this expanded to other industries. What struck me in doing the research on the book was, again, not being that familiar with some of the literature around the history of marketing, for example, in the history of the Industrial Revolutions and industry, is the degree to which marketing and the strategies to actually convince all of us to buy more and more, how integral that is to the story of the Industrial Revolution itself. And a really key moment arrives as World War II is ending, where ramping up to World War II, very famously, there were huge amounts of a huge push towards industrialization around the world. And when World War II ends, suddenly there are all these factories that had been making war material that suddenly had the ability to make more than any other species could ever have even conceptualized. And here we are. And yet we were coming out, the world, for the most part, was coming out of a global depression. And for the first time, perhaps ever, there was a surplus that exceeded demand because people just weren't buying. And some of the tools, marketing tools that had been created early on in the 20th century were really put in place as foundational parts of our industrial age. And as you say, this was very much a question of how to convince people to buy more and more, even if they didn't need it. And one example of this is planned obsolescence, which is the intentional creation of making something technically obsolete much more quickly than it would be otherwise, or to do it stylistically. This started in 1923 at an industrial scale when Chevrolet was looking to sell more cars. And the problem is that by the 20s, people have been buying automobiles for almost a couple decades. They're actually pretty well made. They were lasting. People weren't buying any more new cars. So what Chevrolet did was they took the exact same car in its core, but simply modeled a new shape, an exterior to it, and called it new. And in fact, that very first car was called Superior. And so it was convincing people that this was a superior car that was essentially identical to the previous year, but was a new model. And so therefore, because it was new, therefore it must be better, and therefore you must have it to yourself be better. So it was these kinds of techniques that were already being experimented with pre-World War II that by the 1950s, marketers and industrialists were really embracing and finding ways to convince people to buy more and more. And a really basic way of doing this is appealing to what I see as our deep evolutionary emotions that we, for example, wanting to be beautiful, loving beautiful things, wanting to have friends, right? Being valued by other people, by having status, and convincing people that you can only have beauty, you can only have status, you can only have friends by buying the newest things. And I hadn't realized, so I really delved in this literature, just how intentional those strategies were by some of the founders of 20th century marketing. And I'm susceptible to it, I think we all are, because they're so good at it. But I think this third leap that we're currently in, and perhaps hopefully going to phase out of soon, really is anchored in these ideologies of abundance that are propelling us to desire more and more and more.
There is this tragic paradox, isn't there, that it's not just an ideology. We do live in a time of abundance. You've showed this, and we all live in it, and we know this. And yet we are still driven by feelings of scarcity, never having quite enough money, never having quite enough to live the good life. And I think especially right now with, post-pandemic inflation, and I think most people in the world feel like their standards of living have eroded, and so forth and so on. And whether that's true or not, we have this bizarre paradox of abundance and yet a sense of scarcity. Michael, how are we on time? Do we need to move to questions, or do we have time to?
Well, I'd like to give Chip a chance to talk a little bit about this fourth phase and his family's effort to reduce their stuff, because I think it's a really important part of the book and very moving in a way. I mean, funny. Before, though, I should just say for the audience's benefit, there's also just some tremendous information and staggering information about the amount of waste we generate, and a description to the waste disposal facility outside of Denver and how much they take in every day. And I think anybody who even just takes out their garbage realizes that this just isn't sustainable. I mean, it's a huge problem, and we just haven't come up with a solution for it. So could you talk a bit about your efforts to just live a simpler life in a material sense?
Absolutely. Well, to connect those comments, I do argue that we're not just living in a world of stuff, but we're in an overstuffed world. And you can look at the amount of waste. It's anticipated that the amount of the trash that will go to landfills around the world will almost double by just 2050. You look at the amount of plastics that have been produced since World War II. It's just an exponential graph, and it's just going up and up and up. And a lot of those plastics end up in our oceans. Even on the mountaintop here in the Rockies, there's plastic strewn, microparticles strewn everywhere. So, we are on the precipice of a kind of catastrophe of too much stuff. And as Paul is saying too, I think there's also this just emotional lived experience of this kind of over attachment to consumption and our consumer culture and consumer society. So my family and I, as I was working on this book, we sat down and we looked at different strategies that others have used around trying to live intentionally with the things in our lives. And some people do what's called a no-buy year, where they don't buy anything. Some people try to fit all of their trash into a mason jar, that's it for a whole year. So we looked at different possibilities, and we decided what we would try is what we call the slow buy year, where we would just allow ourselves to buy 5 non-necessities across the year. And, when I first agreed to this with the family, I like panicked because I thought I had this list of all the things I was going to need. But I took a deep breath and it really resisted just that instinct where, you can get almost anything with the click of a mouse, right? And get it delivered to your door. And we lasted about half a year until we decided, this was in the pandemic years, that we thought we needed and wanted a bigger home, which was going to be our office and our staycation spot and everything else. So we lasted quite a while, but even more, just very was much part of us being intentional around what it is we're bringing into our lives and thinking about, do we really need this, or do we really want this? And then if we're bringing it into our lives, is it something that can really last? Is it something that hasn't had a huge impact on the environment and so on? I do argue, though, in this 4th stage, just to briefly note on that. So, it's important when we talk about leaps or stages in these big histories, for me anyways, not to think of this in a teleological sense. I don't see these leaps as like destiny, but sometimes you have leaps backwards or leaps to the side, right? So just because we're leaping doesn't mean it's progress. And so I think what I hope we can do is enter a 4th stage where we have this intentionality around our material lives. And a lot of this is about ourselves. But when I added up how much I reduced my own consumption in that half year, it's 0.0000, on and on and on and on percent. It's just a minuscule percent of the amount of waste the world experiences. So what we need to do is to amplify that at scale, amplify minimalism and a much more thoughtful reorientation in our material lives at scale. So that means doing things like what some call a right to repair act, where a lot of our electronics, for example, are intentionally built so that they can't be repaired by you, even though they could be in theory. So we could pass laws or other kinds of policies, state level, national level efforts that we can make that really will help us reduce our overconsumption and overstuffed world.
Wow. Paul, should we go to the questions? There are a number of them.
Looking at the clock, I'm happy to do that. Do you want to do the first, or shall I?
Why don't you lead off?
Okay. I'll start from the top here, Michael, so we can alternate. This is a question from Lee Dom. Could Colwell expand more on his statement? And here's a quote: "Industrial revolutions, plural. What does he mean by that? And did these all occur at approximately the same time, and where?" So the plural, why the plural?
Great question. Yeah. So most historians talk about not just one industrial revolution, but typically 3 or 4. And the very first, essentially, it is kind of one global shift, but there are distinct phases that historians use to describe the shift. And the very first industrial revolution typically starts in the late 1700s and goes to about 1870 or so. And that's the very first formation of factories. Initially, all these factories are powered by water wheels, fairly rudimentary, but you have the beginnings of assembly lines and sort of the factory system as it's put in place. But by the 1870s, you have steam-powered factories, which can multiply at far greater scales what can be produced. You have assembly lines that are being formalized. You also have the introduction of iron and then steel, which also changes just the tools within the factories and what can be produced. And then by the third revolution phase, really, the third industrial revolution, it's typically placed around World War II. And here you can think about Henry Ford and really the true factory system that can churn out thousands and eventually millions of things with those modern technologies. And then finally, some will use a fourth industrial revolution post-World War II. This is the introduction of plastics, as well as automation, automated factories, and then eventually big data and computerization. So those, just to clarify, those phases are really important to the story because even though it is kind of one long arc, there are really distinguished moments within that arc that are important to pause and reflect upon how they did change the material world.
Yeah, the next question is a question from Bill that has to do with the fact that, which I think you discussed sufficiently, that mobile populations really can't have as much stuff as sedentary populations. I mean, there's some interesting exceptions, but not many. And I think that's a good point that you covered very well. The next comment from Mario, it's interesting. Marx and Engels said that the fact we evolved hands and survived by performing labor was a big part in how and why we evolved into humans. Guess they were right, question mark. What do you think about that?
Very much so, actually. So I do talk about that early on in the book about, how we went from probably not using tools to that initial realization you could use tools. And there's really three key parts there. One is the ability to have a working memory. Right? So if you make a tool, you have to remember how you did it, and so you can keep repeating it. You have to have what's called learning with reasoning. So you need to have some form of logic where you can understand that, okay, here's a dead animal with a lot of meat and some marrow stuck in its bones, and how do I get that out? So essentially a form of logic and reasoning. But then the third part is an actual, physical ability to manipulate tools that you can create. So if a snail, for example, might, hypothetically have a working memory and logic, but doesn't have hands to manipulate and stones to create an Oldowan toolkit, it's not going to get very far. So I love that quote. And it actually does speak to one key part of the puzzle.
Well,
we have a question from Douglas, and I'll read it. Animals that don't have language do have attachments to objects. We see cases where corvids attach value to objects that they perceive have values to others. Is this a primitive association of meaning to an object? If so, is creation meaning emergent and not necessarily tied to language?
It's a good example. And indeed, I talk in the book that there's somewhere around 400 animal species ranging from ants to elephants that use tools. And I do approach this question, I think, cautiously, because I think what we are talking about is a very broad spectrum of tool use. And back to this question of meaning, I don't think you have, one day you have an elephant using a fly swatter, which they use, and then, on a Monday it's a fly swatter, and then on Tuesday it's a trade item that they're trading another elephant, for some other fly swatter or food or something like that, right? And there are very, fascinating, I think, complicated ways that animals use tools. We actually have an article coming up in Sapiens that speaks to this, that we don't, I think, appreciate, because so long we've thought of man, the tool maker, that as humans, this is our domain. And so we've excluded the range of possibilities of how other non-human animals are using these tools. So I do appreciate that question, because I think it points to how we need to be very cautious about what we're ascribing to other animals and not be just dismissive of it. Now, at the same time, there is a difference between, to me, an elephant using a fly swatter and us, how we use fly swatters, and we exchange money for it, and how it positions in our home, and how we consider it dirty, maybe, right? Because it's been used to slap flies with. So the kinds of meanings that humans do put in something like a fly swatter do seem of a different type or kind than what an elephant might use as, or assigned to a fly swatter. But is there some sort of gray area in between? Is there some sort of connection? I certainly would like to be open to that possibility.
Well, as far as we know, elephants don't have debates about whose fly swatter is better, right?
So far as we know.
Anyway, there's a question here from Robert. One aspect of money and things is how they alienate us and separate us from the non-manufactured world. Is this alienation a negative feedback loop that creates the need for more stuff to fill the void or that void? And is it possible to break that loop?
Oh, that's a brilliant question. I love that. You know, I think I mean, this goes to the heart of some of the most powerful thinkers humanity's ever seen. So I'm thinking of the Buddha, for example, right? And the Buddha's argument was we suffer because of our attachments, and we have to escape those cycles of attachment to escape suffering. There's a famous Greek figure, Diogenes, that I write about, who rejected every material thing. And the story goes, he lived in an old wine vase by a temple and needed nothing at all. And people considered him absurd, but also there was this deep curiosity about, how do you live without these things? And that all he had left was a food bowl a drink, no, food bowl, that's right. And then he sees someone eating from their hands, and the story goes, he smashes the bowl because he realizes he doesn't even need a bowl. And so there are these figures throughout history that ask this question of, how do we escape these cycles? And, I would suggest that we have evolved over 3 million years to live with stuff. It is extraordinarily difficult for humans to live without clothing, to live without tools to process food, to have shelter of some form. We have evolved in a symbiotic relationship with stuff. So to truly and fundamentally escape those attachments are probably not possible for the far majority of us. But that doesn't mean we can't live with less. It doesn't mean that we can't constantly be asking ourselves this question and being, I think, as this questioner is saying, that being highly aware of how even the argument to live without stuff might lead to eventually wanting more, and so it's a kind of trap that I think we need to be highly aware of. So I would say, yes, it's possible, but it's extremely hard.
Do we have time for a few more questions, Mike?
Yeah, go ahead.
Just an hour. Okay. So the next question from Charles. In the discussion of money and debt, I feel that the concept of credit or lending is important to discuss, as it enables large technology projects to be built that enable lower cost production.
Yeah, definitively, if you look at the history of especially the origin of the Industrial Revolution, the first Industrial Revolution, a really important part of that is what became the modern banking system and the merchant class. And most of the, whether it was sending out ships for an imperialist or colonialist way to collect raw materials, or building large factories early on, all of that is tied to credit. So absolutely, that is an important part of the story. I think just leaning back to Graeber's argument is that there's a flip side to that it's through credit that individuals and groups of individuals then become indebted and essentially become powerless against those who hold credit over them. So to me, I think they both can be true, and they both are part of this story.
The question by Anne. I have the impression that once societies move beyond subsistence, they quickly, whoops, wait a minute, the screen changed. They quickly start creating aesthetic objects for ritual use and to demonstrate status/power. I'd like to hear Chip's view.
It's certainly possible. One place that I touch upon in the book, but a lot has been written about, is Göbekli Tepe, which is a archaeological site in Turkey, where it seems people, before they even settled down for agriculture, were already settling down for religious purposes, that this is a temple site with very elaborate architecture, very beautiful art that was created there. And it seems that people were living in this almost kind of quasi-urban landscape 1,000 or maybe even a couple thousand years before agriculture fully arrives. And so certainly the pull of beautiful things, the pull of religion prior to a kind of sedentary or farming lifestyle is really important. And I think it speaks to the very, very deep seeds of aesthetic and religious objects that we do see in the archaeological record. Again, it's hard to know definitively what was in people's minds or their intention with some of the scratches that we find on stones and pieces of shell and on cave walls. But it seems certainly by about 500,000 years ago, Homo erectus and some of those other early ancestors are probably hinting towards the first glimmers of beautiful things, of artwork. Probably one of the earliest religious sites in the world is in the Kalahari Desert that dates to about 70,000 years ago, where there is a naturally shaped stone that looks like a snake. And it seems that the rock was shaped to even further look like a snake, and other kinds of rituals happen there, again, about 70,000 years ago. So these are really fundamental parts of how and why humans created things, and also why we settled down to make our modern world.
We have a great question from Jane. There is a masculine drive and focus to the historical forces being discussed. Can a shift to the feminine facilitate the fourth shift, the fourth leap?
Oh, that's a fascinating question. And I would suggest that there's perhaps something to that. I'm not sure how we might define masculine versus feminine, but perhaps setting that aside for a moment, I would point to figures like Marie Kondo, who I actually really like and admire in a lot of ways, even though I think she's actually using her empire to make us sometimes consume more things like bins and whatnot. If you go to her website, she's often selling more things. But nonetheless, setting that aside as well, she is at, I think, the forefront of a really broad movement of encouraging us to reevaluate our relationship to things. And I love how she asks us not to just tidy up, as she calls it, but actually she gives a kind of animacy to objects and to ask, what is our relationship to those things? Has that thing served its purpose? Is it still serving its purpose? If so, you maintain that relationship. If not, you thank it and live with less. And so I think figures like that also, if you look across the minimalist movement, there are a lot of women who are leading the way in the no-buy movement, in the slow-buy movement, in the Nextdoor app, where creating community in neighborhoods where people share tools or give away things that their neighbors need. There's certainly a lot of women at the forefront of those movements. So I think we need to recognize that as well. So I appreciate the question for helping us to pause and celebrate those women who are working so hard to help us live with less.
I'd like to end with a humorous comment that I received from Bill, which says he notices that Paul and I have lots of things in our background, but that Chip has none, which wasn't intentional, as far as I know, though. Chip, isn't it? You're at a radio studio, and this is some kind of workspace or something that you're in.
I am, and that's a funny comment, and I am in a borrowed space here, and frankly, my space probably wouldn't look too different from what you see on the other screens. So, and it's all to just say that I hope one message of this is not that I'm above others, or I'm less susceptible to these things, because I'm like probably almost everyone on this call, if not everyone, which is that I'm attracted to things. I like beautiful things. I love books. Of course, I'm a book writer, and you'd see a bunch of books if I was in my office. So it's not that I'm different. It's rather that it's precisely because I'm susceptible to the same forces that I hope all of us can pause and ask these questions about our relationship to so much stuff.
Well, Chip Colwell, thank you very much. Chip is the author, as you know, of So Much Stuff, How Humans Delivered Tools, Invented Meaning, and Made More of Everything. You've made a lot with our time this afternoon. We thank you for your contribution. We wish you best of luck with this book, too.
Thank you both so much, and thanks for those who attended. Take care.
Bye-bye. So long, everybody. Thanks for joining us. To find out more about SAR, go to our website, sarsf.org or .web. If you no, help me, Paul. What is it?
sarweb.org.
sarweb.org. After 10 years, I should know that. Actually, both of them work, I believe.
Yeah.